Sadanand, thank you so much for being part of the note. Welcome. I'm going to get straight into the questions. And I believe a really grumpy Mr. Donald Trump is finally packing his bags. And at the same time, it's a very tense Washington that's getting ready for Joe Biden's swearing in ceremony, as you call it, the inauguration ceremony in the United States. What's the mood really like in the United States right now?
Well, there's unprecedented security. You would have seen some of those pictures that have been beamed around the world, Mahrukh.
Hmm.
You have a lot of security, and most of that is to ensure that we don't see anything like the chaotic scenes that we saw on January 6th. And I personally think that the ceremony is going to pass without incident, most
Mm-hmm.
likely, because it's being there. Everybody is very well prepared, and people are just being extra careful. But the larger mood, I think, is one of I think many people are happy that we're going to see the end of this particularly turbulent presidency. But I think there's also a lot of soul searching going on. What the events of about what the events of January 6th really mean for the health of American democracy. So in the short term, I think there'd be a sigh of relief certainly among the president's opponents, and but many of his supporters are genuinely seem to have a deep sense of grievance. And my own view is that though we have seen the last of Trump as president, we have not necessarily seen the last of Trumpism as a political phenomenon.
Um, you mentioned January 6th, and honestly, it has shocked not just America, I'm sure, but globally, it has had repercussions and reactions. Uh, you've been in the US. What has been the discourse around it? We've seen a large number of Republicans who were supporting Donald Trump have actually taken a step back and kind of reevaluated their choices. But by and large, that has this kind of brought down a significant decrease in the popularity that Donald Trump has, or does that constituency remain as virulent and as strident in the support for Trump?
Well, it depends on what you mean by significant.
Mhm.
Now, the polls are like there was a recent poll I saw today from Pew that showed that uh, Trump's favorability numbers are down into the high 20s, which is still a little bit higher than George W. Bush's ratings were when he left office after 8 years as president. Other
Mhm.
polls actually show Trump still in the around the mid 30s. So what that, for your listeners and viewers who are not familiar with this, what that means is that he's probably nationwide lost about 10% compared to where he was.
Hmm.
And among Republicans, he has lost some support, but he has not lost a great deal of support. So the
Hmm.
majority of Republicans are still solidly with him, both in terms of voters, at least that's what the polls are telling us, and in terms of the Republican Party. So we did have 10 members of the House who voted for the impeachment, but 10 members of the House is, less than 5%
Hmm.
of the number of the Republicans in the House. So that'll give you a sense of where the power lies. But it's certainly true that Trump, you could argue, is certainly weaker today than he
Hmm.
was before the election or even after the election. So this has certainly weakened him, but we don't know how weakened he's going to be. Right now, he's not. He's still a very powerful force in the Republican Party, and it remains to be seen how this plays out in the months and years ahead.
Interesting that you say that. I read one commentator saying that Trump is the symptom and not the disease. What, according to you, requires fixing in America?
I mean, where do we begin, right? We have like 3 hours to do this.
Mm.
I mean, look, clearly there was a section of the American population that felt that they were getting a raw deal, or that things had not unspooled for them the way that they would have liked over the past 3 decades or even longer. and particularly, I think, among a section of of the white working class, there was a sense that globalization had benefited a set of elites, often on the coasts. It had helped hollow out American manufacturing. It had not necessarily created the kinds of jobs that many of these people were felt that they were equipped to do. And along with that, I think rapid social and cultural change has also kind of left some of them feeling alienated and so on. So what Trump essentially did was he came in and he tapped into a kind of resentment with the traditional elites who had run the Republican Party,
Hmm.
and kind of a general populist mood in the country. Now, Trump did this on the Republican side, but it's also, uh, people, many people have pointed out that there are many people who voted for Obama twice
Hmm.
who ended up voting for Trump. And on the Democratic side, we also had some of that populist energy, symbolized, for example, by Bernie Sanders's campaign. And so the symptom is that this is that there are people in the U.S. for who feel that the system has not been delivering for them. And populism, of course, has become a phenomenon across the democratic world. And what we're seeing here is the American version of that.
Interesting. Sadanand, for a lot of people in India, we see that President Donald Trump is now being impeached. What does this mean for a person who's no longer president? I read Nancy Pelosi, the speaker, saying that what happened at the U.S. Capitol is a act of insurrection. Is now Donald Trump going to face a trial, and what does that mean for his presidency? How does, or his former presidency, as one would call it? Explain to us, explain to audiences in India, because we're not that familiar with what happens and the terms and the manner in which the U.S. presidency works.
Right. So, I mean, as you know, the U.S. Congress has two chambers. It
Hmm.
has the House of Representatives and it has the Senate.
Right.
So the House of Representatives votes, conducts the impeachment. That has already happened.
Hmm.
They've got a majority, and then it moves to the Senate for where for the trial.
Hmm.
Now, he'll no longer be president because the Senate will come back. The trial will be conducted after Joe Biden has been sworn in. So this is
Right.
not going to directly affect his presidency because he won't be president anymore.
Hmm.
But it has sort of the two ways in which it's important. The first is, of course, it affects perceptions. He is the only president to have been impeached twice, and impeachment is actually a pretty rare thing in American history.
Hmm.
Now, if he was a sitting president, when it goes to the Senate, you need 2/3 of the Senate, which would in this case mean which would mean 67 senators. 2/3 of the members of the Senate would have to vote to convict, in which case a sitting president can be removed from office.
Hmm.
This is something that has never happened. Now, it would require 17 Republicans, presuming that all 100 show up to the Senate. It would require 17 Republicans to go along with the Democrats, and then he would be removed if had he still been. But in this case, the removal part is irrelevant
Right.
because he will anyway not be president. The question really is whether they are going to try and bar him from contesting again.
Ah, okay.
And I think that's the thing to watch. Will the Senate move to ensure that Trump can't run again? And that we, of course, we don't know whether that how that's going to play out.
Hmm.
And then the second big question, which is a more of a political question, is that how is Trump's base going to view this? Is the impeachment uh, is this going to strengthen their belief in him? Is this going to make him a martyr in their eyes, or are people going to sort of see that he has done things that are above and beyond the pale that threaten American democracy? And would this
Hmm.
actually end up wounding him and
Hmm.
making him a less powerful figure in the Republican Party?
Um, on the one hand, is this growing polarization? I mean, America stands more polarized today, or at least the polarization has been exposed in a manner that perhaps we haven't seen in the past. On the other hand, when we're still talking about Donald Trump, his social media accounts got deactivated or suspended. There's been discourse over whether this sets a dangerous precedent as far as free speech goes. I mean, we've had Angela Merkel mention it in one of her tweets. What are your thoughts, and what's the discourse on it in the US?
So, my own view is that this was foolish. I can understand that the need to monitor his tweets very carefully, because in this case, you could argue that there was a real and genuine threat of incitement to violence. And
Hmm.
incitement to violence is a line which I don't think that should be crossed. And that those are the few instances in which I am all right with free speech being curbed, right?
Hmm.
But I think simply banning him is excessive, because in general, my view is that when it comes to speech, and particularly political speech, we should be very careful about stepping in and trying to curb it. So
Right.
I think they acted excessively. If they had, for example, said that they're not going to allow any inflammatory content, and they would have they could have monitored it very closely. Or even if they had said that, look, this is a very fraught time because of the events of January 6th, let's maybe we have a temporary suspension until January 20th and a new president is sworn in. Even that, I think, maybe it would be pushing it, but it would be somewhat more justifiable, because again, you
Hmm.
can use the argument that public order and the threat to violence really are important. I am not sure such a broad ban is going to be particularly helpful,
Hmm.
because in the end we have to live with the fact that nearly 75 million people voted for Trump, and you're going to have all kinds of views that are in society, and those views are going to be reflected on social media. So once you start trying to once you sort of go down that path, and you start trying to kind of figure out which views are acceptable and which views are
Which views
not,
are no?
in a way you end up giving people who have not been elected really inordinate power over the public square. And so my own view is that you should tread lightly,
Hmm.
but obviously that's not what the tech companies think.
You mentioned the popularity of Donald Trump. 75 million people voted for him. What did he do right in his presidency that he's garnered such popularity? There must be something that he did right.
Well, he had a booming economy. There's no question about that.
Hmm.
And he is a compelling speaker. He may not be to everybody's taste, but if you watch his rallies, you can see that he has a kind of magnetism that that certainly inspires great loyalty among his followers. He has a very solid base, and I think that his this combination of his ability to communicate, his deliverance of a good economy. He had several foreign policy successes. Many people felt that he had clarity on the problem with China. He had
Hmm.
clarity on the Islamic State, which he ended up defeating on the battlefield. Now, experts would quibble on many of these things, and they would say that
Hmm.
sometimes it was, the it was the sloganeering was more than the reality, right? For
Hmm.
example, on his China policy. But nonetheless, voters did not see, or at least his voters did not see it that way.
Hmm.
His voters genuinely saw him as this outsider who was bold and practical, and who was going to improve their lives. And I think the fact that he got all those votes in the midst of the pandemic was mostly because many people just felt that their own personal condition, their jobs, their pensions, what they had that had improved, and which is one reason also why he in fact got a greater share of the Hispanic vote and a greater share of the black vote.
Hmm.
than Mitt Romney had got, or
Interesting.
that he himself had got 4 years earlier.
4 years earlier. No, Sadanand, one of the consistent criticisms against Mr. Trump has been his lack of respect for institutions of democracy. And many say that now with Joe Biden in place at the White House and in the Oval Office, that resurrection of those institutions has already begun. Having said that, this is not an easy presidency for Joe Biden. Wouldn't you agree? And what do you think are his biggest challenges? And how does he plan to reach out to these 75 million who seem to be completely believing the diatribe that Mr. Trump is giving, the fact that this election is stolen?
So, on the institutions question, I think it's certainly true that Trump, like any classic populist, challenged institutions and
Hmm.
chafed under them. But I don't think American institutions have proved to be weak at all. I mean, look at the media. The media is absolutely free. The media attacked him all the time. In fact, you could argue that the overwhelming majority of journalists in the mainstream media were quite hostile to Trump, right?
Hmm.
The media was not weakened, even though he said things that were unhelpful, right? He said things like fake news, and he was, but the media was not weakened. The judiciary was extremely strong. We saw that in the aftermath of the election,
Hmm.
where he filed more than 60 cases, got nowhere, didn't get anywhere with judges he had appointed, didn't
Hmm.
get anywhere with judges Democrats had appointed. The judges just did their job. They looked at the evidence and they saw that these cases were nonsensical and they threw them out.
Hmm.
So, again, if you look at the armed forces, if you look at the bureaucracy, you look at all of the institutions, American institutions were put through a stress test and they did just fine. And I
Hmm.
think that is the really big difference between what we've seen in the US in the last 4 years and what we've seen in many other places, including, I might add, India.
Hmm.
The institutions have simply not been strong enough to, to deal with this populist onslaught. Now, what that doesn't mean that Biden's going to have an easy task. Obviously not. He's going to dealing with an economic crisis sparked by the pandemic. He's dealing with the pandemic itself, which has where the US's handling of the pandemic has not been that great. We've got the fact that this virus seems to be mutating even as we speak.
Hmm.
You've got the continued problem with the rise of China and their
Hmm.
attempt to show that they have a model that is, more effective in many ways. So obviously he's going to have his work cut out for him. And then, of course, he's got this, bubbling populist anger within America. I think the what he's going to need to do are a couple of things. First of all, most urgently, and I think he recognizes that also, he's going to have to bring the pandemic under control. Secondly, he is going to have to get the economy moving again.
Hmm.
He's trying to bring it back to where Trump had done a fairly good job on the economy. Those are the most important, and I think that he has to find a way to speak to the people who voted for Trump. Now,
Hmm.
some of them are going to be some of them are going to be too fanatical to be reached. But many of them would be reachable, and many of them would, in fact, be traditional Republican voters. And he needs to be able to speak with them. He needs to be able to tell them that he is listening to them also, and that their concerns are important and will be addressed also by his administration. So I think that it's going to be a very, very interesting 4 years because this is I don't think that we've seen the last of this phenomenon. So right, so within the next chapter
Hmm.
has to be written.
And what should be India's expectation from Joe Biden's presidency?
See, broadly on foreign policy, we've seen a bipartisan consensus over the years
Hmm.
for more than 20 years. And I think that both Democrats and Republicans broadly see India as a large, important country in Asia, that should be part of any kind of arrangement that prevents the Chinese from asserting hegemony in the region. So that's something that both sides share. I think what you're going to see a little bit, but you are going to see some differences, and the primary difference is that the Trump administration really didn't seem to care at all about issues of democratic freedoms, human rights, and so on. And my sense is that the Democrats are going to care more. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this, and I don't want to, act as though this is going to suddenly be the number one concern for the Democrats. It's not. The number one concern is going to be similar. But the difference is that if under the Trump administration, that set of concerns were not even on the list, effectively speaking, here they're going to be part of the mix. And I think that is going to be, one of the major differences. There will be other differences. This will be an administration that is much more concerned about climate change, for instance. That's
Right.
going to be. And another big one that will likely affect India is that we may see a move toward some kind of rapprochement with Iran, and that will also have implications for India. So it's going to be different, but I don't think that we're looking at some kind of dramatic change because frankly, if you go back all the way to Bill Clinton's second term, there's actually been a remarkable amount of continuity in U.S. policy towards India.
You mentioned certain things that the Democrats are going to have as part of the list that they discussed with India. And I talk of Kamala Harris. I mean, hailed in India because of her Indian origin, but at the same time, she's critical of a lot of things that New Delhi particularly might be uncomfortable at the moment, Kashmir, among other things. How do you see her relations developing with New Delhi, and what kind of engagement are you already seeing between Indian officials in Washington and Kamala Harris?
See, I think a lot of this idea that Kamala Harris is some great critic of India, I think a lot of that is exaggerated.
Mm-hmm.
I watched that clip that people brought up, which was where she was asked a question about Kashmir. In fact, this is during the primaries when she was still a candidate and trying to get the Democratic nomination. And it was not a pre-prepared statement. It was just someone, if you go back and watch it, it's on YouTube and you watch it, she was at some campaign event and suddenly someone brought this up and she just said the sort of thing that that a politician says, right? And then,
Right.
if you say that, well, Kamala Harris, what do you think about the suffering people in Yemen? And she's going to say, well, oh, gee, I don't want the people in Yemen to suffer, right?
Hmm.
And but our sort of, insane social media in India, which is, apt to kind of like get, worked up into a lather about
Yeah.
everything. They sort of, they made this sound as though she had really done some, deep study of Indian policy in Kashmir and then come up with with this. But, it was nothing like that. I think a lot of people have, overreacted. I do think that in the Democratic Party there is concern. There has been concern expressed by many of the candidates that some of the actions of India, some of the things that we've seen, particularly in Mr. Modi's second term, have been troubling. So there's no question that if you were to talk to people privately and ask them whether they think India is headed in the right direction in terms of managing its diversity, managing its pluralism, I think you'll find, frankly, very few people in Washington who will say yes. You'll basically find two kinds of people who say, no, it's not, and we don't really care because we have other fish to fry, or no, it's not, and this is really troubling, right? And you're going to find more of that second group of people, no, it's not, and this is troubling to us, in the Democratic Party, and including, I would imagine, people like Kamala Harris. So yes, I think it's going to, there's, but again, I think that some of these nuances tend to get flattened in the discourse, particularly on social media. I don't imagine that she's going to be leading the engagement. And, in the end, she has an interest also in maintaining a good relationship with India. So again, we should expect some of these things to be to change on the margin,
Hmm.
but we should not necessarily, I think both the kind of both the extreme right and the extreme left in India kind of, may be imagining that the changes that we'll see will be more dramatic than they in fact will be.
Okay. And finally, Sadanand, have we seen the last of Donald Trump?
I don't think so, frankly. I
Hmm.
think that his support is very strong. He has shown an ability to dominate the news cycle, and in many ways, he has in fact been he's been very good for the news industry. So I'm not sure if people in the news business are ready to let go of their own addiction
Hmm.
to Donald Trump.
Hmm.
And the one thing that I do have, that I do puzzle over is whether he will be able to remain as effective without social media. Because I think so, in his case, Twitter really gave him a megaphone, and
Right.
it gave him a way to kind of inject himself directly into the veins of the nation every morning.
Hmm.
And this ability to set the news to sort of to dominate the news cycle with his tweets, if that is taken away, I don't know how powerful he's going to be without it. It'll be very, very interesting to watch. And at this point, I mean, your guess is as good as mine.
Sadanand Dhume, for your insights and your valuable inputs. Thank you so much for being with us on the note.
Thanks for having me, Mahrukh.